Good afternoon and welcome to the Board of County Commissioners work session. Today is Wednesday, October 21st, and we have on the agenda this morning the evaluation of the extent and reliability of the Denver Basin Aquifer, and I will turn it over to Megan Harrington.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, Megan Harrington, Planning Director. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I don't have too many comments, but I want to introduce to you Bruce Lytle. The county entered into a contract with Bruce Lytle, formerly with Lytle Water Solutions, now More Engineering, entered into a contract with them in July of 2024 with the intent to compile data related to the reliability and the resource that is the Denver Basin Aquifer. That data analysis is complete. After the work session today, we will post the slides and the evaluation on the county website, on the county planning website, along with the video direct to the work session for the public. And I'm just going to turn it over to Bruce. He has a series of slides available for questions throughout. He has a series of slides that explain what went into the evaluation, the science behind the evaluation, and the overall what came out of the overall analysis. So Bruce.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you, Commissioners, for the opportunity to do this presentation for you today. Let me give you a little bit of an introduction to myself. So I have been working in the Denver Basin a lot longer than I'd like to admit. I drilled my first well in the Denver Basin probably 1979 or 1980. I've drilled over 50. I haven't drilled them. I've observed them. Over the past 45 years or so, probably over 50 wells in every aquifer in the Denver Basin, the Dawson, the Denver, the Arapahoe, Laramie, Fox Hills, and all over the basin. So I've drilled wells in El Paso County, Elbert County, Douglas County, Arapahoe County, Weld County. I also did some of the initial research in the Denver Basin related to aquifer storage and recovery as a way to supplement water supplies in the Denver Basin. We did a 6-year research project with the Bureau of Reclamation on recharge. I also did 2 other projects on recharge. So a lot of experience with Denver Basin Resources. I represent a number of entities that their principal water supplies are Denver Basin water, the Parker Water and Sanitation District in Douglas County. I've worked for them for over 45 years, have helped them develop their entire water rights portfolio. Also in El Paso County, I work for the town of Monument, and I've done that for almost 40 years. We are working in eastern El Paso County out in the Upper Black Squirrel designated groundwater basin, again, working with Denver Basin Water Supplies. So very extensive resume with working with Denver Basin Water. In addition to that, that's not directly developing Denver Basin Water, but we have been the water resource consultant to Douglas County for about 30 years. In fact, we did a study for Douglas County somewhat similar to this, where we evaluated the resources of the Denver Basin and then helped them write their Section 18A, which is the Water Supply Overlay District. And those regulations are still in place today. And so since the mid-90s, I have reviewed every land use application that has a water use associated with it to render opinions for the planning department relative to the reliability, the sustainability of the water supply that is proposed for that application. So with that, I will launch into my presentation. Feel free to jump in at any time. If there's something I'm saying that you don't understand or you just have questions or comments, I'm more than happy for it to be an interactive presentation. I always like that the best. So anyway, I'm not sure how I advance this. No, that's a pointer. Did I just click that?
Yep.
Okay. So I wanted to start out just with some basic hydrology. The hydrologic cycle is really the cycle of water falls from the sky, whether it's rain, whether it's snow. That snow melts or the rain infiltrates the ground, and it recharges rivers and lakes and shallow groundwater on an annual basis. So it's an ongoing process that's always occurring. The reason this is important, the Denver Basin really is not part of the hydrologic cycle. The Denver Basin was deposited, the water in the Denver Basin was deposited 50 to 75 million years ago with the uplift of the Rocky Mountains and sediment shedding off of that uplift. And so that water was put in place, but there's very little recharge that occurs to the Denver Basin today. So what we have is basically a big bathtub, a very large bathtub, but it is the water that's in place, and that really is the resource of the Denver Basin. So what does the Denver Basin look like? This is a cross-section going from south to north, and you see Colorado Springs on that. You're at the pretty far south end of the Denver Basin, but it is what I like to refer to as a bunch of stacked bowls. So you've got four principal aquifers in the Denver Basin. The uppermost is the Dawson, then the Denver, and then the Arapahoe. And then you have an intervening Laramie Formation, which is really mostly all shale. It's considered a very low to non-water bearing system. And then the final aquifer is below that, the Laramie Fox Hills. So there's really four principal aquifers in the Denver Basin. And if you look at the plan view on the lower left-hand side, you can see it's like stacked bowls. The Dawson is the smallest because it's on top. And then there's been a lot of erosion. And so the Denver is bigger, then the Arapahoe is bigger than that, and the Laramie Fox Hills is the largest of all the aquifers. Altogether, the basin covers about 6,700 square miles. So it goes from Colorado Springs on the south to Greeley on the north, and from the Hogback, essentially, or the foothills, out to Lyman. So it's a very large area. One of the interesting things, and it's really hard to see, I thought I had changed that to white, but the recoverable water and storage is interesting because it's estimated there's somewhere in the order of 260 million acre feet of water that's recoverable in the Denver Basin. That's a lot of water. If you're not familiar with an acre foot will probably serve 2.5 homes per year. So there's a lot of water that's available in the Denver Basin. And I'm going to stop for just a moment because I left my water over here. So this slide shows the relative position of El Paso County in the Denver Basin. And you cover about 17% of the total area of the Denver Basin. One thing that's interesting is that if you look, the far southern part of the county is entirely outside the Denver Basin. So it's not like there's Denver Basin resources throughout the county. There's only the Denver Basin in the north and eastern part of the county. This is just a showing of how those stacked bowls occur. That gray in the northwestern part is the Dawson Aquifer, and then the yellow is the Denver Aquifer, the pink is the Arapahoe. That kind of thin area of, I don't know, purple is the Laramie Formation, and then that very dark purple is the Laramie Fox Hills. So you can see that the Dawson doesn't cover a whole lot of the county, the Denver quite a bit more, and then the Arapahoe and the Laramie Fox Hills cover a little bit more of the area. But again, this is confined to mostly the northern part of the county. So I want to talk about, going to give a little hydraulics lecture here. And this is incredibly important as it relates to the water supply in the Denver Basin and the reliability of that water supply in the Denver Basin. So there's concepts related to water when it's held in storage in the ground. The first is a confined aquifer. A confined aquifer means that the water-bearing sandstone, for example, is fully saturated and it's under pressure that's greater than atmospheric. So it has not only the water that's contained in the sandstone unit, but if you were to drill just into one sandstone unit, that water level would rise way above the top of that sandstone. So there's additional water in addition to what is actually in the pore space between those sandstone grains. And this is really important, and I'll explain why it's so important just here in a minute. So if an aquifer is fully confined, that means the water level, if you drill a well, the water level is going to raise to above the top of the aquifer. Partially confined, and this happens a lot because these aquifers are being pumped, is that water levels may start out above the top of the aquifer, but during pumping and maybe even under static conditions, they drop part way into the aquifer, but not all the way through the aquifer. And the reason it's partially confined is because while we call it the Dawson Aquifer or the Arapahoe Aquifer, it's not one big aquifer. These are all very interbedded systems where you have these interbedded, it'll be a sandstone and then a shale, then a sandstone, then a shale. And most of these aquifers may have 8 or 10 of these. So really what you have is a bunch of mini aquifers within what's called one aquifer. And so that's why these aquifers can be partially confined, because the lower sands still are under pressure, whereas maybe the upper sands aren't. And that becomes a really important factor when we look at reliability and sustainability of the supply. An unconfined aquifer means that the water level has dropped below the top of that water-bearing strata. And so that water is just contained at atmospheric pressure. We will, I shouldn't say never, but it will be very rare that we would ever get to a fully unconfined situation in the Denver Basin Aquifer. And I'll show you a little bit of that here in just a minute. So just to put this in the context of a water supply system, if you have a pipe, a distribution pipe in the city, all those pipes are under pressure. They're full and they're under pressure. So those pipes are analogous to a confined aquifer. And I'm sure you know this well, that if there's a break or a hole in that pipe, what happens? All that water comes to the surface and all of a sudden you got water flowing down the street because of the pressure on that pipe. That's that pressure where the water level in that pipe would actually be above the top of the pipe. If you had a pipe that was just full with no pressure on it, that would be analogous to an unconfined aquifer. Okay, and I'm going to explain now why that becomes important relative to the work that we have done for you. So this is just to show you, and again, this is a schematic of a Denver Basin aquifer where not all, a formation may be 500 feet thick, but may only have 300 feet of water-bearing material. And that 300 feet is going to be in multiple units. So in this diagram where you see the pipe, which is the well, and you see the horizontal lines, that's the screen that brings the water in and those water-bearing materials. The darker materials don't produce water. So these wells get to be the hydraulics of these wells are very complex because not every sand has the same water-bearing capacity. Not every sand has the same pressure on it. But when you drill a well, what you get is a composite of all of that. And so nobody's going to drill partway into these aquifers because they're expensive and you wouldn't do that. So we don't really know the specific characteristics of every one of these sandstone units within an aquifer. We just know from a composite standpoint what these wells will produce and what the impact is from producing that water. Historically, all of the Denver Basin aquifers have been fully confined. Water levels have been way above the top of the aquifer. Even when you pump it, the water levels stay above the top of the aquifer. So that is a fully confined well, and it stays fully confined whether you're pumping it or not. That's generally not the situation we're in today. You can still see that in places, and I know wells like in Parker that we manage that this condition still occurs, but it's not as common as it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So a partially confined system is when you start pumping and some of those sands, in this particular instance, those two top sands have become unconfined because water levels have dropped locally below the top of those sands. But every one of those sands, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 more, 5 more sands below that are still fully confined. So that's why they're called partially confined, because you have most of the sands below that blue line, which is the drawdown that's occurring from pumping. All the ones that are below that are still fully confined. The ones that are above it are not. So this is, I'm going to go to this next one. So what's really important, and this,
We have a question from Commissioner
Okay.
Nelson.
you want me to go
Go
back?
back a slide. So you were talking about confined is that it's under pressure. So if you go back one slide, where
Let me see if I can.
sorry,
Oh,
there you go. So with this image on the right where the blue line is showing that it's still confined, is there still water available in that sandstone above? It's just not under pressure. Is that correct?
Yes.
So those horizontal lines on the well are still bringing in water.
yes.
Okay.
They're bringing in less water, but yes.
Okay.
Now, because the way this is shown, if we turn that pump off, I would expect that water level is going to come back to a level that is maybe commensurate with the outside of that drawdown cone. And so we are getting water from those sands.
Okay. It's just not as pressurized.
Right.
Okay.
It's under atmospheric.
Got it. Thank you.
So one of the things that I also want to stress is that because this question is inevitable when we start looking at the actual water level hydrographs of the wells, is that we can see some pretty distinct differences in aquifer responses over a short distance in the same aquifer. And I always get this question, well, how could that be? How could this be lower over here and right next door it's higher? It's because of the sedimentation, the deposition of the Denver Basin system. This is what it looks like, is that when sediments were deposited over time, it's just like you can think of it storms today, right? In a stream, if you're up in the mountains and you get a big storm, you can get a lot of flow and it will carry sands and gravels because it's moving fast, and you can keep sands and gravel in suspension and they'll get deposited way downstream. And then you have another storm that's not as intense, and maybe it won't even take any sands and gravel, it'll only take silts and clays. And so that's the kind of depositional environment we've got here. And that's why you've got all this interbedding. And so one of the misconceptions about the Denver Basin is that if you go down and drill a well, that you hit this sandstone unit, and that sandstone unit is just aerially extensive across the basin. Not true. A lot of these will peter out, and so, well, I guess let me, can't seem to get so the cursor here, I don't know if you can see it, but for example, this well on the left has a pretty nice sand, but by the time you move over here, that sand has thinned out and has disappeared. And you see that all over the Denver Basin. So that's why you can drill a well here and get one water level, get one yield. And I mean, I've seen it so many times that it's kind of frustrating, really. You go half a mile away or less and drill a well, and you get a completely different response. And that's just the way it is. So, this is an important factor that I have to take into account, that I need to look at this more regionally and not, oh, that well looks really bad, because then I go, but wait a minute, that well looks pretty good. So you have to look at this on the bigger picture because of this depositional environment. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of that stuff at you. So what difference does it make? Okay. So this is how, if you own a piece of property, this is how you determine water supply availability. It's your surface area, so how big your property is, times the saturated thickness. So how many feet of sandstone do you have in that aquifer, times what's known as specific yield. And specific yield is the amount of water that can drain by gravity to a well. It's not all of the water in the formation. My analogy that I always use for specific yield is a sponge. You can take a sponge, get it all wet, water's dripping out of that sponge, and you can squeeze it as hard as you can squeeze it. The water that comes out is specific yield. But can you ever squeeze it so hard that that sponge is dry? No, you can't. Some of that water is held by that sponge, same way it's held in these formations by surface tension, and that's called specific retention. So that's water that's retained that you cannot get out of that formation. And so that's why you use specific yield to estimate flow availability. Okay? Statutorily, you divide this by 100 because in the state of Colorado and the Denver Basin rules, you have a 100-year supply and you divide it by 100 to get your annual allocation. Of course, as you all know, in El Paso County, you have the 300-year rule, and so you would then take that number and divide it by 3. Here's the important point, is that saturated thickness. Saturated thickness is the amount of water that's physically contained in that sandstone unit, in the space between the grains of the sand, and it's the amount that you can drain by gravity. So in that allocation method, you do not get any credit for the pressure on the system. So there's actually quite a bit more water beneath a property than what gets allocated. Really important concept. That's why I went through the whole confined aquifer thing, is because nobody gets any credit for that water. And I'll give you an example. We have a well that we drilled in 1985 that's been used now for 40 years. The water level is still above the top of the aquifer in that well, which means that not one drop of the 100-year supply has been pumped. So important concept that this allocation formula only takes into account the water physically in those pore spaces in the sand. It does not take into account that pressure. So right from the start, you're underestimating the amount of water in storage beneath any property. And then, of course, in El Paso County, you divide that by 3, so you are spreading that out even more. So this is just to show you how you do this. So you basically take your property, and it's like a layer cake, is that this would represent the ownership of the land. So you then calculate how much saturated thickness there is in each of the 4 aquifers, and then you go through that allocation formula. That's how the water is allocated statutorily in the Denver Basin. So,
Can we just get a moment for a question from Commissioner Nelson?
You're gonna learn. I ask a lot of questions. I think this is
I
so
love it.
fascinating. So that saturated thickness, is that based on a theory, or are they actually going out and taking a measurement to see what that amount of physically contained water is in the sandstone?
good question. So the saturated thickness, the state in 1985 with Senate Bill 5, they came out with maps of the saturated thickness in the Denver Basin. And it was based on all the wells that had been drilled to date. So of course there is some interpolation, maybe some extrapolation in places, but they have some presumptive values. And since that time, they have put online a tool where if you know where your property is, you can put your property in and hit a button, and it'll tell you what your estimated water is beneath your property based on the saturated thickness and its interpretation of the available data. So they update that I think periodically, because obviously there's a lot of wells that keep getting drilled, so we keep getting a better database of what those saturated thicknesses are. But even with all of that, it's possible that, let's say that I estimate I've got 200 feet of saturated thickness in the Arapahoe beneath the property, and you go to court, you get a water court decree. There's always a provision in there that when you actually drill it, if there's 195 or if there's 205, then that number can be adjusted. But my experience has been that we typically come within 5% or less of those estimates. They're usually really pretty darn good.
Commissioner Weissong.
Thank you. When a well permit is issued, does the well driller need to provide the analysis of what they drilled, where they hit certain strata, so that it can be, I guess, update the state maps and things like that?
Yes. So on any deep Denver Basin well that's non-exempt, so, a municipal well, irrigation well, commercial well, yeah, the driller has to file what's called the well completion construction report. I forget the exact name. And so they have to provide generally the geology, obviously all the well completion details. But the main thing, and I'll show you one here in just a second, is that all deep wells have to be geophysically logged. And that's much more accurate than you're standing there and looking at cuttings coming out of the hole and saying, this is a sand, this is a clay. And so these geophysical logs have to be filed with the state, and the state keeps an entire inventory of those. So anybody can go and look at those geophysical logs, but that's what they use to then update this tool that has the saturated thickness at every location. Okay. So the driller is responsible. Typically on big wells like this, there'll be an engineer like me so whenever we're on a well, we'll file that geophysical log, because that's really more of an engineering kind of thing than a driller. But the driller does have responsibility for reporting on the well, the top, the bottom. They have to stay within their permitted range.
Okay, thank you.
So just want to go through this allocation method. So the one thing, there's a number of things that are very simplified in that allocation method, is that they assume that there's just one big sandstone unit. When they do saturated thickness, there's no acknowledgement that this is all interbedded. It's just one sandstone unit. And if you drill a well, it's considered, and you get a saturated thickness from your geophysical log, it's assumed that that's continuous across your property. Probably not true. As I've mentioned, there's no consideration for water that's contained under pressure. And so because of that, there are some misleading conclusions that come out of, this is how much water you have beneath your property and this is how much you can produce. So this is the geophysical log right here. And I know it looks like just a bunch of squiggly lines, and it is, but I'll bring your attention to the right-hand side, those red lines. So sandstones are very resistive, and shales, clays are not. And so every place where you see that line kicking over to the right and going off the page, that's a sandstone. And so I just wanted to show this to show how interbedded these are. You see, let me see if I can get this to work. It wants to bounce around. So this is the sandstone right here. Then this is pretty much non-water bearing. Here's a very small sandstone, another sandstone here. Are you seeing my cursor? Does it show? Okay. And then here's another sandstone. These are probably more like siltstones or dirty sandstones, because you can see they don't have as much resistance. So they might be water bearing, but they're going to be a lot lower water bearing than these nice ones that kick all the way off the page. Right here is a really nice sand because it's thick, it has a high resistivity, and then you get back into some shales and maybe some dirty sands. So this is very typical, is that it goes sand, shale, sand, shale, sand, silt, shale, sand. They're all interbedded. So it just makes the hydraulics of the Denver Basin very difficult, very complex. So this is just an example. This is a well that we drilled. This has been a Arapahoe well, and you can see all the multiple screen sections that we put in. And we typically only screen the sandstone units because screen is very expensive, much more expensive than blank casing, so you don't want to use more screen than you have to. But this just shows, again, all that interbedded nature. So this is just the example of, on the right-hand side is how the state looks at an aquifer, and on the left-hand side is what the aquifers really look like. And so it's a very simplistic methodology that would imply that the hydraulics here are pretty easy to understand. The left-hand side tells you that this is not so easy to understand the hydraulics and what's happening. And the other important point that we see all the time is, are the upper sands the most prolific? Are the middle sands the most prolific? Are the basal sands the most prolific? Obviously, you want the lowest sands to be the most prolific because they're under the most pressure. But that doesn't always happen. And so something that has to be taken into account with every well is, what does it look like? The Arapahoe is famous for having really good basal sands, which is why the Arapahoe is generally across most of the basin considered the best aquifer. Even though it's the third deepest and more expensive to drill, it has generally the best quality and the best production because of the geology in the Arapahoe. I'm really talking here about non-exempt wells. I know we probably have thousands of exempt wells across the county, both in the Denver Basin and in the Cheyenne, Dakota to the south. But we're really just talking about non-exempt wells here. So non-exempt wells are your larger wells. They're your municipal, commercial irrigation wells. And this really, when we looked at evaluating this, we really focused on the non-exempt wells, and there also were a number of USGS monitoring wells, which are really great because one of the things that, again, complicates this is when you start looking at a long hydrograph of water levels in a well. Was that well pumping? Had that well just shut off? Has that well been off for 2 months? Is it a static? So you've got all these different things. And without getting into a lot of detail, when you're under pressure, that pressure equilibrates across the entire area. It's not just beneath your property. So someone pumping nearby under confined conditions is reducing the pressure on your well, even if you're not pumping it. So everything is complex, is the bottom line. So with all that preamble, wanted to get into what we're really here for, which is to go over the results of our study and what it means in terms of reliability, the county policy on Denver Basin, and where do you go from here, I think is kind of the focus here. So what we did is we looked at the structure of each of the Denver Basin aquifers because, again, it changes because you've got some really deep parts of the basin in the northwestern part of the county. As you go east, it starts to thin. As you go south, it starts to thin and actually outcrop. So you've got all kinds of changing conditions within the basin. And so what we did is we put together multiple cross sections so that we could look at each of the aquifers and how those aquifers change. Because, for example, in the northwest part of the county, the Arapahoe may be 500 feet thick. Out east, it might be 200 feet thick, and to the south, it might be 100 feet thick. So we had to put these cross sections together to understand where the wells are and how they operate given their location within the Denver Basin. So the way we've done this is we put out a request through the El Paso County, or I guess it's not the El Paso County Water Authority anymore, it's Pikes Peak Regional Water Authority, I believe. We went there and made a pitch for everybody that's a water provider to provide us with their long-term water level hydrographs. I would say that our response was less than what we had hoped for, but we did get a pretty good cross-section of data from different water providers. And that has allowed us to look at, the reason we wanted these long-term hydrographs is we want to understand what's been happening. You know, was the water level way above the top of the aquifer 20 years ago, and now it's down into the aquifer? Has it been pretty steady? All those kinds of things. So we really wanted a fairly long record of water levels so that we could assess what's going on at that well. And so the other thing that occurs that on the very west side of the county, the aquifers are still very deep, is that there's some faults there. And so unlike in Douglas County, where those aquifers all come to the surface, they don't in El Paso County. They just butt up against the uplift because there's some faulting that happened. And so we have what we call boundary conditions, that if you're too close to an area, typically you want a well that's going to bring water in from 360 degrees around you. But if you get close to like the edge, you may only be getting water from say 180 degrees, because as you start pumping, it reaches out and the Denver Basin's not there anymore. And so you don't get any water from that. Same would be true on the south end. When you get close to the outcrop, now you're getting water maybe 180 degrees from the north, but from the south, you're not. Same thing out to the east, you're not getting as much water. So one of the things we look at is the boundary conditions, and our boundary conditions affecting the yields in these hydrographs. So with that, let me show you the kind of what the basin looks like with these cross sections. So to help with our analysis, we actually made 8 different cross sections, and you can see they're either east-west or north-south, except for HH prime. We did that one specifically because this is a very intensely developed area of the Denver Basin. This is going basically from the Palmer Divide down through the Colorado Springs area. And so there's more wells per unit area than anywhere else in the basin. So we added an extra cross section there. But the idea here was, again, to understand the structure of the basin, how it's changing along these cross sections. And I didn't put all the cross sections in here, they're all in the report, but just to illustrate some of the different areas. So cross section AA prime goes from west to east to the edge of the county. And as you can see, on the very west side of the county, the aquifers are still very deep. In Douglas County, all of the aquifers turn up at about a 70-degree angle along the hogback, and they all outcrop. You don't see any outcrops here. They all are still at depth on the west side. And I didn't put I should have put a legend on here, but the gray is the Dawson, the orange is the Denver, yellow is the Arapahoe, the brown is the Laramie, which is essentially a non-water bearing and not considered one of the principal Denver Basin aquifers. And then that brown at the bottom is the Fox Hills sandstone. So you can see that the Dawson outcrops along as you're going from west to east. So you're looking probably into the Black Forest area here, because this goes across the northern part of the county. The Dawson disappears, it outcrops, and the Denver also outcrops on the far eastern side of the county, whereas the Arapahoe and the Fox Hills extend out past the eastern county line. And then if you go further south, so now we're a little further south and are south of where the Dawson and Denver have outcropped. So now we only have the Arapahoe, the Laramie, and the Fox Hills sandstone. So this would be more down in the Springs area where the Dawson and Denver have outcropped to our north. And so you can see that the thicknesses stay relatively consistent across the county going from west to east, but you're now down to 2 aquifers. DD prime is a north to south cross section, and this would be on the western part of the county. And so you're still seeing all 4 aquifers at that location, because again, we're going from the north end of the county, and the north and the west end of the county has all 4 aquifers. And then again, similar to the last one, if you move east in the county, but you're going from north to south, you've got the Denver, Arapahoe, and Fox Hills. But you can see again that the Denver outcrops. So this would be going to the southern end of the Denver Basin. So all of the formations ultimately outcrop because the Denver Basin doesn't go to the southern end of the county. And so you see relatively consistent thicknesses, but ultimately they all outcrop. So with that, I wanted to go through each aquifer individually. And so what we've done, going back to the figure that has the cross sections on it, these are all of the wells that we were able to obtain long-term hydrographs for. And so this is the Dawson. And as you can see, obviously the highest concentration of Dawson wells, as you might expect, is up in the Palmer Divide area. We've got Woodmore, we've got Denala, we've got Triview, Monument, Forest Lakes. So we've got a lot, Palmer Lake, we've got a lot of water supply districts up in that area. And the Dawson is the shallowest aquifer. So while we see some Dawson wells out to the east, you can see there's not nearly as many. Again, we asked for as many hydrographs as we could get. So I'm sure there's a whole lot more Dawson wells in the county than what's shown here, but we have no way to access water district records if they don't want to provide them. So this is what we used. And so based on that, what we've done, and this will be consistent through all these hydrographs, is we've put the top and the bottom of the formation on these hydrographs because it informs us of where water levels are compared to the aquifer itself. None of these have all the interbedded materials on it because that would have taken a whole lot of effort. And in fact, some of these, we would have a hard time getting them because they're not in the public domain. So these are mostly the wells in that northwestern part of the county. And as you can see for these 3 wells, long-term water levels all at or slightly above the top of the aquifer. So that implies that that full saturated thickness is still at these locations, that none of the 100-year allocation or 300-year allocation, whatever allocation you want to put on it, it hasn't been used yet because the water levels are still at or above the top of the aquifer. But we do have some. The one at the top, you can see, is showing some partial, I would call these partially confined. And again, when I mentioned earlier that you have to look at this holistically, because this well is very close to other wells that were showing water levels at the top of the aquifer. And part of the problem may be that the state over time has changed the interpretation of the top and bottom of the aquifers. And a major change was made in 1985 with Senate Bill 5. So there's the possibility that, for example, that top well was drilled before Senate Bill 5 was given a different top and bottom. And so everything that we're showing as a top and bottom is based on the current law, the current rules. And so if a well was drilled under previous rules, they could have a slightly different, they might not be completed just like the top and bottom shown here. It's just another complexity in looking at this. Here's some more of the Dawson wells. And again, the top one is showing what I would say is a lot of pumping, because you see the water levels drop into the aquifer and then they come back, and then they drop into the aquifer and come back. That's not going to happen really likely under a static condition. More than likely, these wells were pumping when some of these water levels were taken, or they had just stopped pumping, because ultimately, when you look at the far right-hand side, water levels are still pretty much at the top of the aquifer. And so that, to me, is more indicative of just an active well. But the water level, if the water levels are recovering to the top, to your point earlier, Commissioner, about when you're pumping down into the aquifer, those top sands are still producing water. And so because they're still producing water, when you stop pumping, the water level then comes back and those sands are still fully saturated. It's just that you're pumping more than what those sands can produce instantaneously. So you're drawing the water level down, but as soon as you stop pumping, it comes back to the top. You can see again, the one in the middle is indicating some pretty significant dewatering of the top of the system. And then the bottom one again is showing it fully saturated. So based on these wells, few things to note about the Dawson is that the Dawson is the smallest aquifer, covers the smallest area of El Paso County. There are some signs of some dewatering in some wells, but an awful lot of these wells are not showing any dewatering at all. There might be some boundary conditions, but we really don't see that as a big issue. Generally, most municipal water providers either limit or don't use the Dawson simply because that is the aquifer choice for residential wells. And so you have these small residential wells, and to try and protect those wells, typically there's not a lot of production out of the Dawson for municipal purposes, because these residential wells need that as their water supply. So I think that because of that, high production, non-exempt wells, non-exempt again being these municipal, commercial irrigation wells, should be limited because of the interaction between these wells and exempt wells, which are your residential wells. So generally, the Dawson, I think, is still in good shape. All the hydrographs indicate that water levels are still pretty high. In fact, most cases are at or above the top of the aquifer. I really like the one hydrograph that shows the pumping going down into the aquifer a little bit, but recovering to the top of the aquifer. I've always interpreted those kinds of hydrographs as pumping versus non-pumping water levels. So indicating that even those upper sands are still saturated. They're just low producing, which is why the water level is dropping into the aquifer when they're pumping.
So if I could just, going back to our beginning definitions here of that confined versus unconfined, I believe what you said is if it is then fully confined and still at that top level, none of the allocated, whether we're talking about the 100 years the state does or the way that we do it, which is basically a third of that per year, per 100 years, none of that has been tapped into at this point.
Right, there's been no depletion because remember the formula says the saturated thickness, so it is the water contained in those pore spaces of the sand. So if the water level's at the top of the aquifer, then every one of those sands is still fully saturated, including pressure, which isn't part of the allocation. So not only has there been no depletion of the allocation, but there's more water available than even the allocation says.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to just go down through all the aquifers. Okay.
Commissioner Nelson.
Sorry,
No?
just to follow up on, can you go back? I think it's 2 slides where you're showing those hydrographs.
Oh, that's,
One more, I think.
no, I'm going the wrong way.
Oh.
Did you want to go to a hydrograph?
Yeah, like this one. So this top hydrograph, would you define that as non-confined then? Because it does draw down below the top of the aquifer?
I would consider this to be fully confined. And the reason being is partially confined. Let's say if this was partially confined, what I would expect is that the water levels on the left side would be right at the top of the aquifer. And as you start to move to the right side, they would start to decline, indicating that the upper sand has been dewatered. So that'd be partially confined. The fact that it does dip down into the aquifer, but then comes back, I interpret all those low dots, the southern dots or the ones down the aquifer, would probably indicate the well was pumping or had just pumped and it hadn't fully recovered, because then you see a lot of water levels, including all the ones on the far right-hand side where water levels are still at the top of the aquifer. So I think that what's happening is the water levels are at the top of the aquifer. They start pumping, and they're pumping at a rate that's greater than what that upper sand can produce. So the water level declines into the aquifer, but then when they shut it off, it comes back to the top.
Okay. So kind of in summary then on these Dawson aquifers, they are still mostly confined, it appears, because of that water level consistency. Even though we see them dip, they always come back up.
That's my interpretation, yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Weissong.
Need you to go back.
Sorry.
That's a good one. So I'm showing the one in the middle is, I labeled all the wells. So that one you would be partially confined because you're seeing that it's always below the top of the aquifer.
Right, that one would indicate that the upper sands have been dewatered.
And then if you go back one more,
One more slide.
please. And then there at the top, same kind of a scenario. And these two wells are basically right next to one another. I have no idea where in the if that's Woodmore or somewhere else, but so here you're actually are showing on these particular wells, okay, it did drop, 100 feet or whatever it is in volume potentially between this one and you go to the next page, again in the middle, because you're seeing maybe 100, 150 feet. If the water level is right at the 7,000 foot level and the top of the aquifer is what, 72? So,
Yes.
okay, all right.
Yeah, and again, I think in this middle hydrograph, again, I think you see some pumping effects of, if I can. Can't see. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so like right here, you can see that's kind of a classic drawdown effect here and then recovery. And we're missing data, but I think this is probably pumping too. But so under pumping conditions, it's pulling down even further, but then it recovers, but those upper sands would be dewatered, assuming that these top and bottom are correct for that particular well.
Now, since each one of those vertical lines represent a year, how would that water level be taken? Because it's representing a year. How do you know that it's, I mean, other than it looks like it is because it's showing the classic drop down and comes back up. Is that going to be considered, since that's a 1 point in time for a year or maybe a half year? I mean, how realistic is it that you can say that's pumping versus maybe it takes a while for the water that might be outside of that particular sandstone strata, as you said, there could be some leakage between those sandstone within the same aquifer backfilling? Because at that point in time, how do you know that they're pumping?
Well, I don't know. I'm interpreting that because there's no real good reason for the water level to decline like that and then come back up. In fact, the water levels on the right-hand side are higher than they were on the left-hand side. You know, so there's definitely interpretation that has to be made here, and so I don't know that that's pumping, but that's a classic response. Just that curvilinear drop in water level is a classic response to pumping.
Okay, thank you.
I want to kind of just pull on that thread a little bit more because you pointed out just now what I was going to ask about. And I do really appreciate you adding your expertise and context to this. This is exactly why I think it's so important that we're hearing from you directly to be able to identify some of those things that you are more easily able to interpret it with your knowledge. But to the point of those dots being up a bit higher there at the end, and this is yet a pretty long and significant period of time, just any interpretation of that, because again, I would be expecting that to go downward if it were partially dewatered. In my mind, that means if they're above or they're at, I can see how the pressure, you could stay there kind of for maybe an indefinite period of time where that pressure continues, but that once it starts dewatering, then you would kind of see something more gradual. Maybe I'm wrong in that interpretation, so please correct me. But then, and you do have the one initial dot, still just a smidge lower than those three there at the end. But yeah, what would you account for that in particular? And I realize that, again, this is, I think if there's anything that I've learned about water over the years, it's, there's still a lot of unknowns. So, but what would you be with your knowledge, your interpretation?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I really haven't mentioned this, which is that water levels in these wells can be related to the pumping of that well, or they can be related to regional pumping around it. Because remember the pressure. Okay, so the pressure, if I pump my well, I can affect the pressure at someone else's well. So again, lots of unknowns, but my interpretation of this would be that there is less pumping regionally of the Dawson Aquifer because maybe they go into the Denver, Arapahoe, or not using the Dawson as much, so that regionally the pumping has decreased, and so the water level has recovered a little bit. Am I right? It's certainly one interpretation, because there really is, it's not recharge. I mean, because there's very minimal recharge to the Denver Basin. So it's not like a stream or a lake that, that gets recharged every year because it's raining or snow melt. This water is the water that's there. So the only good reason that I can think of that the water levels are actually a little higher recently than they were is just less regional pumping.
So you would basically make that same analysis for the bottom hydrograph where you're at the top of the aquifer in 1985 and then in 1913 or whatever it is, you're way above. And being that this idea is for Woodmore, could this be that they abandoned this well because of being a municipality and then drop down into one of the others and they only use it occasionally?
That probably is a very good explanation. And you also notice there's no water level data more recently, which may indicate, I don't think they probably abandoned it, but they stopped using it or use it very little. So yeah, I would say that's probably a good explanation on that bottom hydrograph.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we'll go to the Denver. So the Denver, as you can see in the yellow, is much more aerially extensive. And just so you know, so all those dots that are up in the gray, they have to drill down through the Dawson to get to the Denver. But one thing I hadn't mentioned is that in the Denver Basin, you can only tap one aquifer. So when they drill up in that area where there's Dawson, they have to seal that off. So they drill down and they can screen in the Denver, but then they have to grout all the way from the top of the Denver to the ground surface. So you can never tap more than one aquifer in a well. So even though there's a lot of those wells that show up in that northwestern part where it's showing Dawson, these are deeper wells that have gone down through the Dawson and tapped into the Denver. And again, same thing. We see a whole lot more concentration of pumping in that northwestern part of the county than in anywhere else in the county. But we did have some data from wells out to the east. And one thing I didn't mention is the wells that have the box around them, those are the wells that we have hydrographs on. So let's look at the Denver. Again, same thing, top, bottom. On all of these, you can see that water levels are pretty significantly above the top of the aquifer. The bottom one is kind of just above the top, and there's not a lot of really recent information on that. The one at the top here is kind of your classic response for a well that's being used, in that the water level was significantly above the top of the aquifer, and over time you're seeing that downward slope, although the water level's still at the top of the aquifer. But this is kind of the classic response, and probably the one that you hear about the most, right? The Denver Basin is dropping X feet per year, and people extrapolate that to the bottom of the aquifer and say, oh my God, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Again, little simplistic explanation, but that one at the top is showing that decline. In other words, some of the pressure is being reduced on the system, but again, still at the top of the aquifer. The one at the bottom, not sure why that's showing the way it is, because it's a bit of an anomaly, but obviously it's showing pretty significant dewatering of the system at that location.
Got a question, if you go
Sure.
back. The well ID is the same until you get to your RAH. So did maybe that just get plugged. But then if you also last reporting period, the one in the middle, we don't see anything after 2004-ish. And then you're seeing it at the bottom of the aquifer going all the way out to 2013, almost 14.
Yeah, so what the identifiers, so a -F means a non-exempt well. FR means it's a replacement of that original well. So this would imply that the middle hydrograph was the original well. The one at the bottom is a replacement well.
Interesting. Okay.
And you can see that the hydrograph on one stops where the hydrograph on the other one starts. So I've just,
But the water level is,
yeah, I mean, we'd have to look into that more specifically. That's why some of that doesn't make any sense, really, right? Because a replacement well has to be within 200 feet of the original well, or it's not a replacement well. And so you've got the water level at the top of the aquifer, and then you immediately drill a well within 200 feet and the water level's halfway down. Something doesn't seem to fit there. Here's some more wells. Again, really consistent water levels at or above the top of the aquifer. And that top one, again, you know, this is that whole complexity and how many sandstone units you have and permeability of them, where they're located, because you've got a lot of head, a lot of pressure on that one at the top. The one in the middle, again, I think all those really low water levels are pumping, because then the water level recovers really to the top of the aquifer. And there wouldn't be any reason for that to happen other than pumping the well. If you pull the water level down that far, really what you're doing is you're pumping the well at a rate inconsistent with what the aquifer can produce. So you can pump a well, particularly these wells that have 500 feet of thickness. You can pump a well really hard and draw that water all the way to the bottom of the well. But as soon as you turn it off, it comes back, which means that you're really pumping the well a lot harder than you should, because the aquifer just won't produce that kind of water. So I think that that's what you're seeing in that middle hydrograph. But again, the other hydrographs are showing water levels at or significantly above the top of the aquifer, again, indicating really there's been little to no depletions associated with the Denver. Again, we've got two wells that are at above the top of the aquifer, one that's showing significant dewatering. And when you look at this, a lot of times these ones that are showing some amount of dewatering are surrounded by other wells that aren't. And so that's why you really have to look at this holistically and not look at one well hydrograph and say, oh, the aquifer is really in bad shape. You need to look at the whole picture of the aquifer.
So in that case, sir, would you say then where you have that single well that is kind of an outlier amongst at least these three, and would you say then that that is more likely to its surrounding areas and what's also being pumped at the same time, and a more of a regional effect? Or would you say that may be a difference in those layers as we talked about in the beginning, or maybe both?
Could be both. We'd have to really dig down and understand, because the one thing that we got water level hydrographs, but we didn't get pumping records. So we don't really know regionally what's going on per unit time. The fact that these water levels are fairly consistent, but you see that kind of sawtooth effect in that well. I would again interpret that pumping, not pumping, pumping, not pumping. And so the water levels are staying fairly consistent. They're low, but they're staying fairly consistent. So really would have to look at how much is this well pumping, who's pumping around it. And, you know, that kind of detail is really beyond the scope of
Because
this.
we're looking at the overall, and I appreciate that. You know, we don't want to extrapolate something from a minority type of data here when we're trying to look at the entire thing. But going back to the one previously where we talked about the replacement well and thinking through both regional effects and, you know, you saying there's something kind of not right here with the data. Is it possible? And I mean, is it possible the replacement well, or even some of these, it's just like bad luck, you picked the wrong spot based on some of those layers? And if that's the case, are there methods that are currently being used to try and choose the best spot, which might even be within a single property?
So your first question, I can't imagine that because, again, a replacement well has to be within 200 feet. If they had moved a half a mile or a mile away, I would absolutely agree. But 200 feet, that'd be pretty quick to have that significant a change. So I don't think it's related. I kind of wonder if maybe there's some glitches in the data on that particular one, because like I say, we had the last water level data in the original well. It was still at the top. They re-drill it and it's immediately halfway down. So
They were
either
wrong
there's-
either in the first place or in the second, maybe?
So, and I'm trying to remember what your second question was. Oh, about regional.
No, actually, so, and maybe it's more of a moot question with your first answer, but in the event that someone has a large piece of property and they are looking at drilling a well, but it could be different, to your point, a half mile away or whatever, on a large piece of property, choosing a wise location seems to possibly have could make a significant difference in how productive that well is. So is that looked at when those wells are drilled? Are there technologies available to try and pick that best spot amongst the property, or not so much? Luck of the draw.
I would say not so much. There is. I mean, you can do geophysics to try and estimate it, or you could use a water witch. But I don't think that there's a lot of technology that really helps you with that, you know, other than understanding what's around you and looking at other geophysical logs. It's a bit of a crapshoot, because I can tell you we've drilled some wells that we didn't think were going to be great that turned out great, and then vice versa. And we've got a property in Elbert County where we've drilled 4 Denver wells. 3 of them produced between 50 and 75 gallons a minute, and 1 produces 400. All on the same property, 1,300 acres. So a couple square miles, and we're seeing that kind of difference. So
I have several questions here, so we'll start with Commissioner Weissong, and then we'll go to Commissioner Nelson.
To piggyback on to Commissioner Geithner, you were saying that Senate Bill 5, in 85, that they've created maps. How close, and do those maps then get updated based on like the 4 wells that you just referenced? Does that information on that single property then go back into the maps and update those?
yeah, so in 1985, this is Senate Bill 5, which brought in the modern law that's still in place today. And so they developed what are called the Denver Basin Rules. And part of the Denver Basin Rules are maps of every formation with contours of the saturated thickness based on what they knew in, of course, in 1985. And so with the modern era and computers and everything else, they've digitized all that and into this tool that I was telling you, where if you know the piece of property, you can go in, put in the meets and bounds of that property, and it'll tell you what the estimated water allocation is. It's an interpretation of those maps, and they do update those maps. I couldn't tell you how often. I'd have to ask somebody at the state, but of course there's been lots of wells drilled since 1985. And so every well that's a non-exempt well requires that geophysical log be filed with the state. And so they have a whole catalog of that. And so they're constantly refining what those saturated thicknesses are in locations, particularly locations, you know, as you go out east, as you go up and down the I-25 corridor, that's where the biggest concentration of wells are. And so that was pretty well defined. But now as you move out, like Albert County, for example, there wasn't a lot of data in Albert County in 1985. There's a lot more wells out there now. And so they do update it periodically. I couldn't tell you how often, but they do add to that database to make it even better. And like I say, whenever I've used it and then drilled a well, we've usually come within 5% of what that estimate is. So the tool's pretty good.
So the 4 wells that you drilled and you had the one outlier at 400 gallons per minute, that you didn't expect it based on the map data.
Right. And so that's the other thing that really is part of these hydrographs, but is not in reality, is that you may have the same saturated thickness, say, along the Palmer Divide as you have out at Yoder, let's say. That doesn't mean that they're going to produce the same amount. You know, a well over here might produce 500 gallons a minute and a well over here produce 100 gallons a minute, because while you still have the same amount of sand, this sand out here has got a lot of silt in it, whereas this sand over here is nice coarse sand. And so that isn't taken into account in the formula either, or in these hydrographs, is that I may be looking at a hydrograph that's pumping 500 gallons a minute or 100 gallons a minute. And so to your question, the saturated thickness was not a whole lot different in the well that produced 400 than the other wells. So the maps were still pretty good, but somehow what we think is we hit a bunch of fractures that improved the permeability so that the saturated thickness wasn't any different, but the ability for that to move by gravity to a well was greatly enhanced. So when we submitted that geophysical log, I don't think it really changed their maps, but the yield was obviously a lot better.
Thank you.
Mr. Nelson.
I have a question and then just kind of a comment. Can you repeat again what -F, what the definition was on that hydrograph?
I'm sorry.
-F. You said -F-R was a replacement of an original well, and then -F on the labeling of the hydrographs.
Yeah, any non-exempt well,
Okay.
permit is always going to be 5 numbers and then a -F.
Okay.
That's a non-exempt well.
So commercial.
If it's a residential well, it's going to be 6 numbers and no suffix.
Okay.
When you replace a well, then they add an R to it. So it'd be -F-R.
Right.
So that's how I knew that was a replacement well.
Okay. So just when I look at, you've presented 15 different wells here, and 2, maybe 3, if we account for this one that's on the screen right now in the middle, have a downward trend of the water level. So 2, maybe 3 out of 15 are showing a little bit of a downward trend. The rest have consistent water levels. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's why I say you have to really look at this holistically and not get caught up on one hydrograph. Oh, I'm not sure if we went through that. So the Denver and the Arapahoe generally are the workhorses in the Denver Basin, mostly because they're below where residential wells are. Although if you get out to the east part of the county where the Dawson's gone, you get a lot of residential wells in the Denver. But generally, the Denver and the Arapahoe are your most densely developed aquifers because of their quality, their quantity, and their relative cost. So the Denver, deeper than the Dawson, but above the Arapahoe. The Arapahoe has generally the best quantity and quality, so that's a very desired aquifer. As we just talked about, there does appear to be some local dewatering, although overall, we don't really see that. The Denver still is in really good shape. The Denver does outcrop as you go south, and outcrops on the very eastern side of the county. And again, what I hadn't really emphasized is even if there's a fair amount of saturated thickness, as you move east and as you move south, a lot of times the yield of the wells go down because, again, that depositional environment, the highest energy you can keep sands and gravels entrained, which means that they're going to be mostly on the west side. And as you start to go east, you're going to get a lot more silts and clays, even in the sands. So that, again, not all sands are created equal. Some sandstones are very high producing, and you might have the same thickness of sand out to the east that has a lot less production capability. So just because you have that saturated thickness, but again, go back to that allocation formula, not taken into account. So you get the same amount of, if you have 100 feet of sand over on the west side, it's nice, clean, coarse sands, and you have 100 feet of sand out here way east, you get the same amount of water allocation, even though it might take you one well to produce it all here, it might take you 3 wells to produce it out here because the yields are a lot lower. But I think that overall the data from the Denver indicates that it's a very viable water levels generally at or above the top of the aquifer. So again, little to no depletion of those, whatever allocation you want to use. If it's still at the top of the aquifer, the full allocation is there.
Commissioner Nelson.
So we're talking a lot about movement this way of, confined, unconfined. Are there measurements taken for the outcropping boundaries changing? Like I'm picturing a reservoir that as you have water exit down the river, not only does the depth change, but also the width or the parameters of that boundary changes. So are there ever measurements taken where we see that the measurement of the square footage of coverage of the aquifer is
I'm not sure
narrowing?
I'm understanding the question.
So we know that there's a boundary where the aquifer,
you mean the edge of the aquifer?
yeah, it
Okay.
outcrops. Is there anyone monitoring that moving? Like if we know that there's a southern boundary, that boundary is gradually moving more and more north.
Oh, I see. You're saying you're not talking about the geologic boundary. You're talking about, are the water levels receding?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
I was
Sorry.
a little thick on that one. No, they're really not. I mean, the water levels will decline vertically, but it's not like they're going to start receding. I guess they do a little bit because water levels are declining. But really, when you've got a well, it's got that radius of influence that's pulling water in. And so when you're close to the boundary, you can't get as much water coming from that side, and maybe you don't get hardly any, but you draw it from the rest of it. But the well will still have water. It's not like the whole water table starts receding.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
The one thing that you did mention that I don't think maybe that's what you were talking about, but I'll address it anyway, is the vertical movement of water. So wells in each of the aquifers, because you have these screens and all these multiple, and typically it's gravel packed through that whole thing. So all of those interbedded sandstones are all connected and can enter the well through that gravel pack. And so when you have these pressures that are different, you may have different amounts of water coming from different sands. And so you can have vertical movement. In fact, you do. In our ASR study, there was some really interesting data, but that's for another time, that you can get the vertical movement in there. But there's also been questions, I get this a lot of times, is if you're pumping the Denver, are you going to affect the residential wells in the Dawson? And the answer is no. There really is not vertical movement between aquifers. There definitely is within the aquifer and all the sandstone units in the aquifer, but not between aquifers, because again, you have to seal it, and because it's interbedded, the way the state has set up these formations is there's always a pretty thick shale between each aquifer. And so that shale I won't say there's not one drop, because even shales have a limited permeability. Nothing is impermeable, but it's very, very low permeability. And so those shales keep from vertical movement. So if you're pumping the Denver, you're not affecting the residential wells in the Dawson. I don't think that was your question, but I answered it anyway.
But that's a very important thing that you just brought up. So I want to kind of put that into real world context just to make sure that I'm understanding here clearly. So if we have an area that maybe has 2.5, 5 acre, or even beyond lots that are all on individual wells, and then there is also a neighborhood or development that is served by like a municipal water system, obviously a water district or something in the unincorporated county. And the local wells are in the Denver, right, which would be typical. And I assume that's mostly just because it's expensive to drill wells that deeply. But so you've got all of those houses around that are in that scenario. Maybe it's a Black Forest type situation, and then you have other more dense developments that are on that municipal water. If those wells are into the deeper ones, it is not going to affect those homeowners that are surrounding there as long as they're in the different aquifers.
Right. If the homeowners are in the shallowest aquifer, and it could be the Dawson or the Denver, depending on where you are in the county, then if there's larger wells that are in that aquifer, they absolutely could be affecting them. But if they're completed in the aquifer below it, they
Like
will
in the
not.
Arapahoe, then it won't affect. So likely, I don't like to speak in absolutes, but so likely if we have those municipal type wells that are in the Arapahoe, they're not going to be affecting surrounding neighbors because they're going to be in the Dawson or the Denver, likely.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I want to add to that. Is there any kind of water court limitation that when someone applies for a permit, that would be in a municipal or a community well type service, that you have to go down to a different aquifer because of the amount of wells? In other words, let's say on the north side of, whatever street, you've got a whole area of 2.5, 5 acre, individual wells. And on the south side of that street, they've decided for 500 acres or whatever it is, they're going to build a big community, smaller lots, higher density, and they're going to put in a well serving all of that development.
No. So you would not get a water court decree that says you have Dawson water beneath you, but you can't use it because there's residential wells around you. Now, there is a process in the water court where that could happen. And so when you make a water court, let's say I make a water court application, I'm a developer, I want, some municipal wells, and all around me are 5-acre lots that are all on residential wells. If that, let's say homeowners association or whatever, wanted to object to them using the Dawson, they can enter that case and make a case that their use of the Dawson should be limited. But they would have to proactively do that. A water court's not going to say you can't use it, because again, it's all presumptive on the Denver Basin that, assuming that it's been deeded to you, that water can be developed if you go to water court. And so that's all the water court does, is they determine how much water and what the annual allocation is, and that's the basis of the decree. So they would not limit it unless there was an active opposer to the case trying to get it limited because of the interference effects.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask a question of the board here. Is that something that we could ask Megan to look into, to evaluate as one of those questions going forward? I'm not saying it's an edict, but I could see where that could be a potential issue if you have to be proactive and the neighborhood doesn't know what aquifer they're going to be drilling into, and all of a sudden now they run out of water. How can we be proactive in that situation?
So I think, I would think we probably want, I was gonna say our attorney to weigh in on this. And if I could just, I'm gonna let him speak, but I also want to, I'm gonna let our county attorney speak.
It's been a while, apparently. Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, I would have some concerns about exceeding the county statutory authority with that sort of approach. What I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, is do some research as to what the parameters are and provide that to you offline.
Very good. Thank you.
So I'm going to add my portion here, which is exactly what I was going to say, is we'd want to have the county attorney kind of look into that, because when we have people with rights that are dictated and thinking about what our authority is there, I think there's always room for discussion about what we want to do. I also think that we probably want to look into whether that is actually a concern. My thinking is, based on what I know from most of the water districts, is they are not in that shallowest aquifer, based on my knowledge. So I think that's a good question for us to follow up on, but it may not realistically be something that is happening. And we would want to probably determine even both what our authority is in that, but also how often that even would be happening, because I believe that most of the municipal water sources are going into those deeper aquifers. I think Commissioner Williams also has a question.
Does some of that information also come in our packet with the water determination letter as to which aquifer they're drilling into and those kind of things?
I see Ms. Sego standing up, so she's going to come and talk about the determination.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Lori Sego, Senior Assistant County Attorney. To answer your question, Commissioner Williams, if I understand it correctly, when we have a proposed subdivision that's going to be on central water, we do require, as part of that water resources report, an accounting of the wells on which that water district or water service provider relies. And so generally we see that in a table form. So it will list all of their wells. It will list all of their it'll list all of their water rights, whether they've got wells in them yet or not. And so we can see what water rights they own, in which aquifers, which wells they have drilled. Hopefully they're also telling us which wells they plan to drill in the future. So the short answer is yes, we should be receiving that information from our central water providers.
Well, if I could, the issue obviously is well-to-well interference, that if you have a big well, how much impact is it having on these smaller wells? And in Douglas County, they require, if you're in the area on the west side that's more at risk, they require applicants to provide a model showing what they're going to produce and at what locations and how much interference they're causing the neighbor wells. So that's how we deal with it in Douglas County. All right, so the Arapahoe Aquifer, and as you can see, the Arapahoe Aquifer is the workhorse, has way more wells than any of the other aquifers. But this is why we constructed the HH prime cross-section, because as you can see, these wells kind of trend down that western side of the aquifer in the county. There's still wells out to the east, not nearly the density. And of course, there's not the population density either, so there's not the need for as many wells out to the east side of the county. So the Arapahoe, because the Arapahoe is kind of the workhorse, you're seeing a lot more of these, what I call classic responses. In all three of these hydrographs, you're seeing that trend of a lessening of pressure. Water level still above the top of the aquifer, but you can see there's a trend down. So these wells are being used, in my opinion, these wells are being used quite a bit. They're producing a lot of water, and so they're just regionally dropping that pressure on the aquifer. But again, still above the top of the aquifer. Here's some more. These are obviously more monitoring wells. You can see water levels are just consistently staying at the top of the aquifer. No real deviation either up or down. Here's some more, again, showing that decline, but still fully saturated. So still pressure on the system. Water levels are above the top of the aquifer or at the top of the aquifer. But you see that kind of classic trend of this is an aquifer that's being used quite a bit. Same thing here. Again, all of these are showing water levels right at or at the top of the aquifer. And now you see some that are indicating some partial desaturation. The one at the bottom is kind of interesting in that the water levels are really low. And again, maybe this well stopped being used, or regionally there's some lessening of production. But to have that significant an increase in water levels indicates that on the left side of this hydrograph, there might have been some pretty heavy consistent pumping, and then maybe the well got shut down or being used a lot less, because I can't think of another explanation of why you would go from a greatly dewatered situation to a fully saturated situation unless the pumping was causing these water levels to be low. So that's where a lot of this interpretation comes in, is that we weren't given full pumping records of these wells, so we're having to interpret the water levels.
Commissioner Williams.
So in this formation, the Arapahoe, since you're having to go down an extra 1,000 feet for your well, or do you think we're serving more houses with these? Because they are more expensive wells to build. And so you could see a greater use of them and the water level going down, because they're probably serving a larger development as opposed to back in the Dawson where you may have had an individual homeowner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you won't see any individual residential wells in the Arapahoe. They're
Yes, so these are
way
the-
too expensive to
Yeah,
drill.
these are our larger developments then.
Yeah, unless you get way to the south end or the way to the east end where the Arapahoe is the first aquifer.
Yes.
But generally speaking, the Arapahoe is fairly deep, and these are expensive wells. So just to give you an idea, a typical well is going to cost probably $600 to $700 a foot.
Mm-hmm.
And these are 1,500, 1,800 foot wells. So when you do the math, by the time you equip these, a well is going to cost a couple $1 million.
Okay.
And so, yeah, these are going to be wells that are producing a lot of water, which, you know, is good that the Arapahoe is so productive. And yet, for most of these, the Arapahoe is still at the top of the aquifer for the bulk of these. And again, keep in mind, a lot more water produced on the Palmer Divide than out at Falcon, say.
All right.
Because I've drilled both. And the wells out in Falcon in that area are more like 50 gallon a minute Arapahoe wells. They're also a lot shallower, so they're cheaper to drill. But definitely production rates drop as you go from the northwest to the east or the northwest to the south.
Okay.
Okay, I want to pull on that thread a little bit because as we were talking about, and actually, could you go back one slide?
One more.
Maybe one more, sorry. Yeah, so you have some of these that, you know, you're seeing some of the decline, but to your point, are at the top of the aquifer. So again, going back to your definitions, we would, understanding that there's a lot of pressure on the system, I'm kind of interpreting this as this pressure is kind of a extra, if you will. And what we would expect of a well is for it to be in an aquifer like this that is a a defined amount of water to be. I know it's not the you can correct me on my terms here, but ultimately we would expect those to decline. It's the matter of how quickly they're declining, and again, if it's above the aquifer, we still have that 300 years available. Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. And because you see these declining water levels, it's just indicating that the Arapahoe is the workhorse. And you can see, like on that middle one, you can see the water level goes down, goes up, goes down, goes up. You know, it's a very small, but that's to me indicating pumping, not pumping, so on. And you see that cycle all the way through there. But when you step back and look at the whole hydrograph, you can see that there's a trend down, but still above the top of the aquifer. Just tells you that this aquifer is being used quite a bit, so that it's dropping that regional pressure, but it still hasn't gotten enough of the pressure off even to get to the top of the aquifer.
I may have should have asked this question when we were talking about the Denver, but for example, I know from my time on the Water Authority that there are wells that it is coming up on that they believe are being recharged by, for example, Cherokee is the one that comes to mind, where they are seeing their wells increase near the areas where they are essentially watching that water matriculate back, into the soil. And so they're seeing increases in their wells. So that is a possibility from some of the water districts that we're hearing from, but maybe that is more in the more shallow.
Yeah, that would be in the shallow. There's not going to be local recharge into the Arapahoe.
Right, because it's so much, and that's why I say maybe a better question in the Denver, but that is obviously a possibility in the Denver, at least from the water providers that, like I said, Cherokee comes to mind in particular, the wells that they have closer to some of their facilities that, again, they are dealing with wastewater and having that, go back through and be filtered into the ground, that they are seeing those increases. So have you seen that much of anywhere, or is that kind of an anomaly? That's definitely, they've said 15 to 20 feet differences where they're seeing it go the other direction.
Yeah, I kind of respectfully disagree with that interpretation. I think that it's a lot more likely that the reason their water levels are rebounding is regionally there's less pumping. These things are so interbedded, and we see really thick shales, even at shallow depths. So you're just not gonna get significant recharge, except where it's outcropping, then sure. Now it's sinking directly into those. And so you could potentially, but I would say it's a whole lot more likely that what anybody is seeing in a Denver Basin well where the water level increases, it's because of decreased pumping either by them or regionally or both.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I think, yeah, so the Arapahoe it's just the workhorse. It is the favored aquifer, even though it's more expensive than to drill a Dawson or a Denver well. The Arapahoe is just the aquifer of choice because it has the best quality. For the most part, you can pump Arapahoe water and chlorinate it and put it right into the system. These days, sometimes we get into some iron manganese problems. They're usually pretty minor. So when you got an aquifer that's the best quality and the best quantity, even though it's more expensive, it actually is a better bang for the buck. And so that's why the Arapahoe is used the most. The hydrographs to me indicate that the Arapahoe is still in really good shape. As we've seen on those hydrographs, yeah, some of the pressure's coming off, but if the well's been pumping for 20, 25 years and there's still pressure above the top of the aquifer, I'd say we're in pretty good shape. Again, even though it might have the same saturated thickness, yield per well, which isn't really a measure of reliability, it's more a measure of how much you have to pay to get it out of the ground, that if you go east, if you go south, you are going to have a lot more wells just because the yields are going to be lower. But I think it's a very viable water resource. Everything that we're seeing from the data that's been provided to us, that the Arapahoe is in really good shape. So the Laramie Fox Hills, this is the deepest because not only do you get to the bottom of the Arapahoe, but now you got to go through the Laramie, which is a non-water bearing shale. And typically that could be 200 to 400 feet thick. So the Laramie Fox Hills is a very deep aquifer. But the other thing about the Fox Hills is its depositional environment was totally different than the Dawson, Denver, and Arapahoe. Dawson, Denver, and Arapahoe were deposited due to the uplift of the Rocky Mountains and then shedding sediments. The Laramie Fox Hills was there. It was part of an inland sea. And so you've got really fine sands, not coarse sands, really fine sands, but they're more uniformly distributed because it was just the base of this inland sea. So the Laramie Fox Hills and Laramie was sitting there when the Rocky Mountains started to uplift and deposit the Arapahoe, the Denver, and the Dawson. So totally different environment, depositional environment. But the Fox Hills has a bit of a bad reputation because A, it's deep, so it's very expensive to drill. It typically has some water quality problems. The Laramie and the top of the Fox Hills has coal deposits, so you can get methane, you can get hydrogen sulfide. And because it was an inland sea, but it's not like the oceans today, it wasn't that salty, but it can have a elevated salt content. And so the Fox Hills is not really very well developed in the county. As you can see, it's pretty well spread out. And where you saw all that concentrated pumping up on the Palmer Divide and the Dawson, Denver, and Arapahoe, don't see that in the Fox Hills because, again, deep, not great production, although pretty good production, but the water quality is generally can be the issue. So when you look at the Fox Hills, because it's not used very much, like that top one is fairly typical of a lot of pressure on the system and continuing. We just completed a Laramie Fox Hills well in Elbert County that had 600 feet of pressure above the top of the formation, which is pretty remarkable. As you can see, that middle one looks like there is some pumping, which creates that kind of looks like a wave of water levels just doing this, pumping, non-pumping, but again, above the top of the aquifer. And you're going to see the same consistency on all these because the Fox Hills really is not used much. And so the water levels have historically been well above the top of the aquifer and probably will be for quite a while because it just is not very well developed. But it's typically might be 600-700 feet deeper than the Arapahoe. So that adds a lot of cost at $700 a foot to drill. But it is fully confined. Again, no depletions. So whatever the allocation is in the Fox Hills, probably countywide has not been touched. So again, because of that, we consider that to be a really viable water supply source. And really what's necessary is potentially some treatment. We just drilled 2 Fox Hills wells out in the Peyton area, and those wells came in and had twice the production of the Denver and Arapahoe wells out there. So they're actually in that area are the best producing, is the best producing aquifer. When you come back to the west, it's the Arapahoe again. But as you move out towards the outcrop areas, the Laramie Fox Hills is actually the best producing aquifer. And it's because of that different depositional environment where you lose that energy as those deposits were being placed, in that as you move east or south, you're getting a lot more silts in it. Whereas the Fox Hills, that was just the bottom of that inland sea. And so the deposits on the west side are a lot like the deposits on the east side or the north side. So you get a lot more uniformity in the Fox Hills. So to kind of bring this to wrap it all together, I don't see the Denver Basin aquifers as being immediately at risk. Obviously, the concern about the Denver Basin aquifers is it's a non-renewable resource. It's not being recharged. And so it's a big bathtub that is being lessened. But at least the data today show that it's not been lessened to an extent that would cause immediate concern. Now, do you want to stick with the Denver Basin forever? Maybe not. But right now, I would not say that the Denver Basin is in any kind of a crisis mode, that it's a good, reliable source of water. The Dawson is probably the least productive, but if that is generally reserved for residential exempt wells, then that helps preserve that Dawson supply. And I think most water providers, meaning municipal water providers, special districts, pretty much limit their take on the Dawson. And so that helps to preserve that for the residential wells. And so I guess my basic conclusion is you have developed and had for, I guess 40 years, I think. I think your 300-year rule was developed back in the 80s at some time. That I think that having that provides an extra layer of protection above the statutory 100-year supply. But either way, if there's still pressure on the aquifers at the top, and then through every sandstone unit, that you've protected the aquifer very well, and that I wouldn't recommend that you do any policy or code changes on the Denver Basin. I think you're adequately protecting that supply as best you can, being a non-renewable resource. I have one other thing, and maybe you want to hear this, maybe you don't. I'm kind of on my soapbox here. Is that before 1969, groundwater use was not regulated at all. And then in 1973, Senate Bill 213 came in and established the minimum useful 100-year life, so that allocation formula. And then in 1986, and this is the law today, the Denver Basin Rules, Senate Bill 5, continued that whole allocation approach, that 100-year. But recently, the state has come back with what they call a total allowable withdrawal. And in my opinion, this is really a bad decision. We were actually part of a group that challenged that, went up to the Supreme Court, and we lost. But what the total allowable withdrawal says is that you have this 100-year formula, and once you pump 100 years worth of water, you're done. You can't pump anymore. So where we've seen a lot of these wells that have been pumping for 20 years or more and are still at the top of the aquifer, that doesn't matter. The state is counting that against your 100-year supply so that you could get shut down when there's still a lot of usable, economical water to produce. And again, I'm on my soapbox, so I'll stop. But just so you're aware that that is the law right now, that you have that 100-year supply, and you can divide it by 3, but that total volume, once that's pumped, you have to stop. And so your whole water supply goes away, whether there's water beneath your property or not. And I think that's a bad idea, but anyway, I won't belabor that. And I'd been asked to put some of these potential discussion issues. I think we've kind
Before
of
you
gone-
move forward, I know there are either some questions or comments here, and I saw both Commissioner Weissong and Vice Chair Williams at the same time. So I'm going to go over here and then over here. Go ahead.
So your total allowable withdrawal would be how much you can withdraw in 100 years,
It's the volume.
the
The
volume.
volume that you calculate is available. And so
So if I
once
use
you
all of
pump
that,
that volume, you have to stop.
so if I use all of that within the first 5 years,
Well, you can't do that
well-
because they do break it into an annual.
okay, so if I use it all up, if I'm living in a 101-year-old house and I've used all of my 100 years, then I have to dig another well?
No,
I'm just
no,
done.
you're out. You're done.
Okay, so
You
we're
can't
bringing in
use
the
it
water
anymore.
truck.
You can't use it anymore, even if there's water still available.
Oh, that's an interesting concept, yes. And yeah,
Interesting is one word, but I
don't know what else to call it.
to me, it makes no sense, because Senate Bill 213, which came in 1973, and I've talked to the guy a long time ago about, okay, how did this allocation formula come about? And he told me, well, we didn't know what to divide it by, and we thought 100 years was a nice number, and so we just used 100 years. It was totally arbitrary. But Senate Bill 213 says that what we want to preserve is a minimum useful life of 100 years. So that would imply that you take your 100-year supply, you divide it by 100, that's how much you can pump each year, and you can keep pumping that as long as there's water. And that's the way I've always interpreted it. It wasn't until a couple of years ago the state said, no, there's this total allowable withdrawal, and if you hit that number, then you're done. And so, that was challenged by a lot of entities, but it went up to the Supreme Court and they sided with the state.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Okay.
Commissioner Weissong, and then we'll go to Commissioner Nelson.
Okay, so we're 52 years into 100 based on when that law went into effect. So when you if you sell a house or a property, whatever it is, and you're no longer the owner of that well, does it start over again?
No,
So that well rides with it. So if thinking down 25 years from now, someone buys a house and they could be basically shut down in 25 years of owning that house. I mean,
Well-
hypothetically.
well, keep in mind, this is really for non-exempt wells.
Oh,
Not
okay,
residential.
okay. All right. Well, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So is it that piece of property now is dry? What happens if it's been subdivided or whatever? I mean, there seems to be a, all right.
Yeah,
Your
I
facial
mean,
expression says it all, that this is dumb.
It makes no sense to me. You know, like I say, we've got wells that have been producing for 40 years. The water level's still above the top of the aquifer. So we haven't dipped into one drop of the 100-year supply, but under this rule, we've already been debited 40 years.
Okay. I need to stew on that.
Yeah.
Commissioner Nelson.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around. Are you saying that the state has come out and said that a property only has water rights for 100 years, essentially? And it's not a sustainability measure? So it's not like, we only want you to use X amount of water within 100 years. And if you hit that X amount of water before your 100 years, you have to wait till that 100-year date comes, and then you get another X amount of water allocated. It's this property only gets 100 years worth of water to use. And in 100 years, you no longer have water rights?
Right. Yeah. The theory, which is totally erroneous, is that they draw a box, right? Let's say this tabletop is your property. You've got the water beneath that property, and because you estimated the water and divided it by 100, or not even divided by 100, let's say not divided by 100, there's 100 years of water beneath your property, and they take that as a box that you're going to drain that box in 100 years, and so you should be shut down. Well, it totally ignores the hydraulics of the basin. For one, groundwater is constantly moving. So there's water moving onto your property, there's moving off your property. Pressure is not taken into account. But yes, they're saying that here's your box of water, and once you've pumped that box of water, your water right is done.
And that was, you said non-residential, so commercial, agricultural, like a farmer. Sorry.
Yeah, it's any non-exempt well. So the municipal wells, the commercial wells, irrigation wells, where they have to allocate based on 100 years. Residential wells don't do that. They're allocated a flow rate typically, and depending on where they are, in-house use, or they have an augmentation plan or whatever. And so they really aren't affected. It's the big wells that are affected by this.
So as we're approving metro districts that are tapping into waters, they essentially are time bound of within 100 years, they need to figure out a different water source?
Yeah, they'd be bound to that 100-year supply spread out over 300 years here.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think this is a very interesting conversation. This piece in particular about the decision and the legal decision. My interpretation, and again, if I'm not getting this right, please correct me here. But my interpretation of this is the state's going to take away your water before you run out.
That certainly there's potential for that, yes. And so nobody knows. I mean, if you've used up that 100 years, can you go back to court and reapply for some different amount of water? I mean, none of that's been addressed. And of course, I'm not going to have to worry about it, but it does bother me that it just doesn't make sense. It's always been, like I say, Senate Bill 213 had the specific language, minimum useful life of 100 years, which meant that they were trying to preserve it. But if you went more than 100 years, you still could.
So there's
And
some
that's always been
value.
my interpretation.
There's value to conservation then.
Yeah.
It sounds like in the system, there's at least not as much value or little value in conservation of that resource.
Well, no, there is value in conservation, because let's say your allocation is 100 acre feet per year, which would be 10,000 acre feet total for 100 years. But let's say because of conservation, you're only using 60 acre, make it 50 acre feet so I can do the math a lot easier. So if you're only pumping 50, but you have 100 acre foot annually, then you can stretch it, because again, it's pumping that 100-year volume.
So it's
so-
not just time limited then, it's actually volume limited.
It's volume limited. Yeah.
But to
So they're
what
not
they
saying-
assessed is 100
Yeah,
years.
they're not saying you're out in 100 years. They're saying you're out when you've pumped your 100-year supply. So in my example, if you had 100 acre feet, but because of conservation, you're only pumping 50, the water's going to last twice as long.
Okay, I think that we were trying to figure out what is that, was that time limited or was it actually? So there is still value in that conservation. They're not going to shut you off at 100 years if you haven't indeed pumped that full allotment. It's just that there may be more water there under your property than what that allotment is, and that's the piece that we're talking about. And so it sounds like, I think, Lori, before you head back up, so make you have to walk back down, it sounds like then because of the way that we have our 300-year water rule, and that essentially forces more conservation. That's my kind of interpretation here, because they're essentially using a third of that per year, right, over that time period, that we would still have the full 300 years, not the 100, because it's not time limited.
Yeah, no, it's not time limited, it's volume limited. So conservation absolutely is a great idea.
Got it. Commissioner Williams.
I think it helps, regardless of what Lori's going to say, for me to wrap my head around it, is to remember this is groundwater. Am I right? Because like City of Colorado Springs, Aurora are both fed by the Homestake Reservoir, which is not groundwater. So a lot of our major cities, I don't know what the city of Parker's water source is, but a lot of the major cities are coming out of reservoirs, not groundwater. And so you have to think of it in terms of maybe an area like Falcon, or, Black Forest has a lot of individual wells. Woodmore is served by a couple of wells. You have to think of the areas that are served by wells and groundwater as opposed to the areas that are served by Colorado Springs utilities and coming out of the mountains.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really focused on entities that are primarily relying on Denver Basin.
Yeah, because otherwise I would say Aurora and Colorado Springs are taking all of the groundwater for all of the groundwater developments, but they're not. They're getting them from the mountains.
Yeah, this would not apply to the surface water supplies.
Okay, I think we cleared that one up. Now we understand it. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
So that's the end of my presentation. I was asked to just list a few of these things that kind of, if you have any lingering questions about any of the major topics that we talked about today, I'd be glad to answer any questions, but otherwise, that's the end of my presentation.
Commissioner Weiss.
One of the most common questions that we hear, not necessarily here on the dais, but my water level in my well, and I don't know what that means, is dropping.
Mm-hmm.
It could be still above the aquifer level. We don't, most people don't know the answer to that question. So you could be 500 feet above and you're dropping 20 feet a year. It's going to be a while before you ever get to the top of the aquifer. But in general, what is your statement to people when they say, well, no, my water level in my well is dropping? How do you find an answer to that question?
Well, the first thing I would do, and you know, I get people calling me from time to time with that basic question. And so the first thing I do is I get their well permit number, because I can look these things up online, is to find out what aquifer they're in, what the top and bottom is, where their water level is. Because like you say, I'm not surprised that water levels are dropping in anybody's well, because again, this system isn't being recharged. So we're relying on the water that has been laid down in this basin over geologic time, pretty much. I mean, yeah, there might be a little recharge, but it's so minor that you aren't going to rely on it. And so you really need to have a lot more information, because the fact that water levels are declining, I'm not exactly shocked. I mean, sure, I'm not surprised. It depends on where you are, how much pumping is going on around you. One of the things I see all the time with residential wells is people not drilling the well to the bottom of the aquifer because they don't want to spend the money. So, for example, up on the Palmer Divide, the Dawson may be like 700 feet deep. And I'll see wells that are 400 feet deep and they don't have that much water. And so they're only tapping the upper part of the system. So there may be some pressure on those lower sands that composite wise would actually raise their water level. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this, but you have to look at each well individually to understand, what does that mean that water levels are dropping? Is it a concern, or is it just doing business in the Denver Basin?
So to answer that, obviously need more information. Does that well permit tell you whether they went to the bottom of the aquifer or not?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because they have to file a well completion report. And so I can look up that, let's say the Dawson is 700 feet deep. I can look up on the well completion report how deep they drilled.
Okay.
So I know if they fully penetrated the formation or they didn't. And it's very common for residential wells not to, because they're spending a lot of money and they don't want to go all the way down. I don't know if it's still the case. It used to be a lot of times it was, let's hit water and then we'll go 100 feet. And there might be 400 feet of water in the aquifer, but they don't drill to the bottom.
Do you have to drill a replacement well, or could you pull everything out and then in the same well drill down to the bottom of the aquifer?
No, typically these wells, you have to have grout in them, and so you're putting cement around the casing.
Okay.
So you really can't pull the casing and drill deeper. So if the water levels are dropping such that you're causing your well problems because it's not fully penetrated, you got to drill a whole new well. That's why I always advise people, I know it might cost more, but drill to the bottom of the aquifer, because let's say it's 700 feet, you drill a 400-foot well, and at some point in the future it fails. Now you got to drill another 700 feet. Now you're drilling 1,100 feet. Drill the 700 feet to start with.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Nelson.
I have a feeling we don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyways. Do we have any sense of how much water is down there in these aquifers? So when you say 1 acre foot serves 2.5 homes, I think you said that earlier. Was that a year?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to gather. We see that in the Arapahoe Basin, there is a decline. It's still above the top of the aquifer. And it's been over the last 25 years or so that we've seen that decline. I'm just trying to think about the future, and science technology is constantly being things are developed. And I guess I'm just trying to understand, as we're tapping into these aquifers, it right now seems like we're okay, but for how long? And like conversations that maybe it's not today, but in the future boards are going to have to decide when a policy change may need to happen or something like that.
So, yeah, I mean, one of my early slides showed what the estimated recoverable water is, but that was basin-wide. I assume you're a lot more interested in just the El Paso County part of it. But, you know, I haven't calculated it for El Paso County. We could, but the number basin-wide is somewhere between 200 and 260 million acre feet. And El Paso County covers 17% of the basin. I would not do that math straight because I think that while you're 17% of the basin, I'm guessing that you're less than 17% of the water, just because you've got all the outcrop areas and such. But yeah, it can be estimated. But again, that number is based on the water in the sandstone units. It's not based on the total water supply with the pressure. That would be really difficult to evaluate.
Right. So I'm sorry, I'm like just thinking theory and the future, thinking out loud here. You know, maybe it's at the point that we see these aquifers hit no longer being confined, that's then when we can have a better estimation of here's the amount of water truly available and how long it will last.
I think the better, you know, that's a crystal ball thing, and I don't know that I would rely on that much. I think your better position would be to revisit this periodically and to see what's happening. Because again, and I haven't really touched on this, is that when it's under pressure, there is a very small amount of water that's released per unit volume. But when you start draining the aquifer, you get around 1,500 times more water per unit volume than by pressure. And so that's what's so complex about this, is as you start to draw down into those top sands, they're producing much more water per unit volume than the lower sands. And so you've got this super complex hydraulics that, I mean, you know, this is more than a PhD dissertation, really. I'm serious. And so to me, the more realistic position would be, let's just look at the data and keep looking at the data. I mean, it's not like you got to do it every year or anything, because it's not changing that fast, but a periodic relook at this to understand, okay, when are we starting to maybe hit that tipping point where now we need to be more concerned about it? Because if an aquifer were to go from totally confined to totally unconfined, what you would expect to see is you'll see a decline until the pressure comes off, and then that drawdown will flatten out because you're getting 1,500 times more water per unit volume.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think just looking at real data over time is your best bet. I mean, we could spend a lot of time trying to estimate the water and when the tipping point would occur, but I think you're a whole lot better off just
Monitor the
looking
data.
at real
How
data.
often would you recommend that being done?
I would say at a maximum, you know, every 5 years or so, because like I say, it just doesn't change that quickly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's good. The nice thing about these hydrographs is it's telling us that the water providers are keeping track. They know what's going on. They can see what's happening. And so that's good because they pay attention to that. But as far as looking at this more holistically, you don't want to overdo it because it's just not going to change that quickly. So.
Okay. I think, thank you for walking me through that. And just, I think we have to put it in perspective that, yes, there are wells showing a decrease. There are a lot of wells showing very consistent water amounts. And it would be easy to get fearful about seeing those decreases. But to your point earlier, well, yes, because it's non-renewable, we're using it up. But that doesn't necessarily mean we need to change how we're operating, and conservation is going to be important. And I love whoever thought of this 300-year rule in the past, or 40 years ago. Good job. But this is really informative, and thank you for bringing it.
I think the key is be diligent about keeping track of what's going on and how things are changing.
Thank you.
Additional questions or comments from commissioners? Well, I will say thank you so much for your work on this, and I think this is really helpful. I live in the unincorporated area, and this is something that has been really important to me for several years. I'm really grateful to our county administrator and to Megan Harrington and all of the water districts who were willing to cooperate and share the information, because I do think this is hugely important. And I have said before, I want to be able to look my neighbors in the eye and say, I'm doing everything that I can, and that we are looking and we're not turning a blind eye to this. So I think this is particularly meaningful to me. So I really appreciate it. And to so many of the questions that we have, I think we would love to be able to quantify all the mysteries of the world. And it's obvious that this is a very difficult and complicated topic, as you said when you began. Your recommendation that our 300-year rule is doing its job is really encouraging. And I think we're, to say keep looking is a great recommendation as well. And I'm certain that this board will continue to keep looking at this. Appreciate all of the insights, all the great questions from my colleagues today. I think that piece of, understanding that wells perform very differently. And so we have to take all of that information together as a whole, but encouraging that in some of those areas, we haven't even begun to tap that 300 years allocation yet is also very encouraging. And I'm glad to hear that our conservation does matter and the state isn't going to punish us for that. And it's not just years limited, but it is actually that volume limited. So with that, I will just say thank you again. Really appreciate your professionalism during this process and your vast knowledge. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just put up my contact information. If anybody, commissioners, anybody in the audience has any questions, I'd be glad to talk to anybody about this or anything in general. I like doing that. So
Great.
feel free to call or email anytime.
Great. I'm just going to look to Ms. Harrington. Do you have any closing comments at this time, or are we ready to adjourn? Okay, great. Well, with that, we've come to the end of this work session, and this meeting is adjourned.